I never thought this would happen to me. Michael muttered under his breath as he opened the envelope on the kitchen counter. The papers inside were official, stamped, and final, confirming that he had lost his job and that Sarah had already filed for divorce. And in that instant, the world he had known for years shifted in a way that left him dizzy and quiet. The suburban house around him was still the same. The maple tree outside glowing in the early evening light. The dog curled in its bed. The refrigerator humming softly in the background. And yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. He dropped the envelope onto the counter and ran a hand through his hair, thinking about the mornings he had spent making coffee, the evenings checking bills and balancing spreadsheets. All the routines that now seemed like a fragile scaffolding holding up a life that had quietly fallen apart. Sarah's footsteps on the hardwood floor behind him reminded him that she was there, poised and calm, as if nothing had changed, as if the room could still be a space for comfort and conversation. And for a moment he wanted to say something, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in his throat, and all he could do was stare at the neatly stacked dishes by the sink, the keys on the counter, the lights slipping through the blinds in golden stripes. He thought about Jason, the best friend who had been around for years, always the supportive presence in social gatherings, always the one who Sarah now intended to make a central figure in her new life, and the thought burned like a quiet pulse in his chest. A mix of disbelief and the sting of betrayal. Michael sank onto the chair by the island, letting his hands rest on the surface as he absorbed the news, the paper stiff against the wood. And in that stillness he replayed every casual remark, every late-night call, every weekend she had needed space, that in hindsight now carried a pattern he had ignored for far too long. He thought of all the small signs, the subtle changes in tone, the way conversations had become shorter, the way smiles had seemed distant, and it all came together like pieces of a puzzle that now formed a picture he could not unsee. He realized that the life he had been living, the home he had nurtured, and the trust he had placed in his marriage were all being quietly rewritten without his consent. And yet, in the midst of this emotional upheaval, Michael found a strange clarity forming in his mind, a sense that he had to act not out of rage, not out of despair, but from a place of measured understanding, of seeing the truth as it was, and planning how he would navigate the days ahead. He glanced at Sarah, whose expression remained composed, and at that moment he knew that the dynamic had shifted, that the next steps were no longer guided by routine or expectation, but by the choices he would make in response to the revelation. And in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by familiar objects that now felt charged with new meaning, Michael allowed himself a single deep breath, the first in a series that would carry him from shock toward the resolve to face the reality of a home, a marriage, and a life that had been altered in ways he had never imagined. Michael sat silently at the kitchen island, the envelope still open in front of him, sunlight fading into the evening sky through the blinds, and the suburban quiet pressing in from outside, making the room feel both familiar and alien at the same time. Sarah stood near the refrigerator, hands folded tightly, a forced calm in her posture, glancing at Michael as if waiting for a reaction that never came, while the dog lay quietly on the rug, oblivious to the tension that now saturated the air. He ran a hand over the counter, feeling the smooth wood under his fingers, and thought back on every subtle change he had dismissed over the past few months, the late meetings, the small lies, the evenings when her attention seemed elsewhere, moments he had chalked up to work stress or tiredness. And now all those small details aligned into a picture he could not ignore. His thoughts traced the life they had built together, the dinners shared, the weekends planning trips that never materialized, the laughter echoing down the hallway. And he realized how quickly it had all been rearranged without his awareness, a quiet shift that now felt enormous. He noticed the envelope again, the stark print of the divorce notice, and the weight of it seemed to settle over him like a tangible object, pressing into the space around his shoulders. Yet he remained still, breathing slowly, resisting the urge to speak or move, letting the reality of the situation unfold in its own time. Michael's eyes flicked toward Sarah as she spoke softly, attempting explanations and reassurances, yet her words hung in the air like paper in a breeze, moving but not connecting, and he recognized the careful control in her tone, a pattern he had seen before but only now understood, the way she had always tried to maintain appearances, managing every detail so that she appeared composed even while creating distance. He recalled the weeks of subtle changes, the evenings where plans were altered without reason, the casual mentions of Jason, the best friend who had been a constant presence, now taking on a significance that Michael had not considered until this moment. And he felt the quiet sting of realization that he had been an observer in his own life, watching it shift from the center to the periphery without noticing until the change became undeniable. The light in the kitchen shifted as the sun dipped further, casting long shadows across the floor and highlighting the familiar objects. The fruit bowl, the keys, the half-filled coffee mug, that now felt laden with new meaning, each one a marker of the ordinary life that had quietly been transformed into something foreign. Michael exhaled slowly, the sound absorbed by the walls around him, and he considered the steps ahead, knowing that whatever came next had to be measured and deliberate, not reactive, because the clarity he now possessed required calm action. The room remained quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the wall clock, yet within that silence, a profound understanding settled over him. The life he had thought secure had shifted, and his response from this point forward would define the next chapter, shaping how he moved through a world that now demanded vigilance, awareness, and above all, the kind of quiet strength that comes from seeing truth as it is. Michael finally rose from the kitchen chair, letting the envelope fall gently back onto the counter, and took a slow step towards Sarah, whose eyes had been fixed on him, careful and calculating, as if she were trying to read the reaction he would give. The air between them was heavy with unspoken truths, the kind of tension that stretches a single moment into a memory, and he felt the weight of months of subtle changes press into the room like a physical presence. He looked around at the familiar details, the fruit bowl on the counter, the keys near the sink, the half-full coffee mug, and realized that every ordinary object now carried a new significance, markers of a life rearranged without his consent. Michael's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but firm, asking the questions he had postponed until he could hold them in a measured space. And Sarah's responses came slowly, clipped, careful, betraying only the edges of her intentions, the words chosen to maintain an appearance rather than admit reality. Jason, standing in the background by the doorway, shifted slightly, his posture uncertain yet deliberate, aware that the quiet in the room had changed the dynamics, that Michael was no longer just reacting, but observing with a clarity that made even a glance a form of communication. Michael traced his mind back through months of minor anomalies, the phone calls taken in private, the evenings she claimed were for work, the casual mentions of Jason woven seamlessly into conversation, all dismissed at the time as insignificant, yet now forming a lattice of patterns that told a story he could no longer ignore. He thought about the mornings they had shared coffee, the evenings they had spent discussing weekend plans, the small rituals of a household maintained in cooperation, and understood how slowly, almost imperceptibly, the life they had built together had been divided, a quiet shift he had been too patient to notice until now. Each breath he took felt deliberate, an effort to keep control, to let the room reveal itself without embellishment. And in that silence, the true scale of what had occurred became unmistakable. He realized that his own restraint had been a shield, allowing him to see more clearly, to assess without being clouded by anger or panic, and that insight, hard-earned, was now his advantage. A foundation on which he could decide how to move forward without being manipulated by expectation or guilt. Michael's eyes met Sarah's again, steady and unyielding, and the small tension in her shoulders, the careful placement of her hands, all indicated that she understood he had shifted, that the quiet had become more powerful than any argument, and that the next choices were entirely his. He glanced at Jason one more time, noting the subtle apprehension in his stance, a recognition that the dynamics of the room had fundamentally changed, and then took another controlled breath, feeling the determination to navigate what came next with calm authority, understanding that observation and patience were now his tools, and that the unfolding moments in the kitchen, though seemingly ordinary, carried consequences that would resonate far beyond the space of that suburban home. Michael remained still, letting the quiet stretch in the kitchen, each second revealing the depth of what had been hidden for months. Sarah's hands rested lightly on the counter, a small motion meant to convey calm. But her eyes flicked toward Jason briefly, betraying a nervousness she did not voice. He traced the familiar surfaces, the worn edge of the island, the refrigerator magnets holding faded notes, the coffee mug she always left half full, and recognized how ordinary details now carried weight, markers of subtle changes in routine and attention that had signaled a growing distance. The dog stirred slightly in its bed, but remained silent, as if sensing the tension and choosing to stay removed from the human dynamics. Michael's mind replayed the past year. Each late night, she claimed to be at work. Every weekend, she suddenly needed space. Every mention of Jason casually dropped into conversation, and he saw them now as pieces of a larger pattern that had quietly reshaped his life. He inhaled deeply, noticing the way the evening lights softened across the countertops, casting shadows that seemed longer than usual, and the hum of the refrigerator became a metronome for the clarity settling over him, a steady rhythm against which he measured his own calm. Sarah spoke softly, choosing words that were measured and careful, attempting to frame her actions as minor and understandable. But the effort was transparent, and Michael felt no need to challenge her, for the truth was already visible in the posture, the hesitation, the small gestures she could not fully control. Jason remained by the doorway, one hand in his pocket, shifting slightly as he realized Michael was no longer reacting emotionally, but observing, absorbing, and understanding the patterns, and that quiet strength made the presence of both adults in the room feel entirely different, as though the power had shifted without any dramatic confrontation. Michael thought of every shared morning and evening, the dinners planned and sometimes missed, the quiet weekends once filled with conversation and laughter, now replaced by small absences, gaps in attention, moments of disconnect, and he recognized how patient he had been, how long he had allowed the space for the relationship to exist in the way he wished rather than the way it had actually become. He noticed the subtle signs of control and premeditation in Sarah's manner, in the way Jason lingered near familiar surfaces, as though claiming parts of a life he had no right to. And Michael felt a measured resolve growing within him, an understanding that the next steps required both observation and calm action rather than confrontation. The kitchen, familiar and domestic, now felt like a stage where clarity and restraint had become the defining forces. Each sound, each light reflection, each small motion weighted with meaning. Michael's hands rested lightly on the countertop, fingers tracing the edge, as he considered how to proceed with dignity and awareness, knowing that his reaction would set the tone for the unfolding events, and that the quiet, deliberate presence he maintained could achieve more than any raised voice. The room remained calm, ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in emotional density, and Michael allowed himself one long, steady breath, the first of many that would carry him forward with clarity, patience, and the subtle authority of someone who finally saw the full shape of the life he had built and the changes imposed upon it without his consent. Michael moved slowly toward the living room, the weight of months of quiet observation pressing on his shoulders, and the room seemed different now, every detail ordinary yet charged with meaning. Sarah remained near the kitchen doorway, her posture careful, hands lightly resting on the frame, glancing toward Jason, who lingered at the edge of the room with subtle unease, aware that the tension had shifted dramatically. Michael's mind traced every small action, every overlooked conversation, every subtle change that had seemed insignificant until now, realizing how the life he had taken for granted had been quietly rearranged without his knowledge, and how patience and observation had allowed him to see the pattern fully, to grasp the scale of the change with calm clarity. He noticed the faint light falling across the hardwood floor, highlighting the coffee table, the rug, the cushions in the living room, each ordinary object now standing as evidence of the home he had built and the spaces that had been redefined without his consent. He thought of the weekends once shared, the dinners where conversation had flowed freely, the mornings spent together with coffee and plans for the day, and he recognized how distance had been growing, small and imperceptible, leaving him an observer in his own life, watching the subtle shift in presence and attention that now culminated in a quiet confrontation. The air in the house felt still, heavy with unspoken truths, and every breath Michael took was measured, steady, giving him the control he needed to understand the scene. to see the reality without letting emotion cloud judgment. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing by marking the rhythm of thought and perception. Sarah attempted explanation, her words carefully chosen, her tone measured, but Michael heard beyond the phrasing, reading the intent behind each syllable, seeing the effort to maintain appearances, and recognizing that the truth of her actions had long been established, the quiet accumulation of decisions, choices, and interactions now laid bare in the ordinary space of the living room. He considered Jason again, standing near the corner, shifting slightly, a silent acknowledgement that he too understood the new dynamic, that Michael's calm observation had altered the balance, that the presence of authority and restraint was now more powerful than any argument or emotional plea. Michael allowed himself to revisit the past, the months of subtle changes, the late evenings when Sarah's attention seemed elsewhere, the small gestures that now formed a consistent pattern, and he understood how patient he had been, how he had absorbed the shifts, and how that patience had prepared him to see clearly and act deliberately at the right moment. The room felt familiar and foreign at the same time, a domestic space filled with objects that now carried weight, the ordinary, reflecting the extraordinary, and Michael recognized that clarity, observation, and measured response would be his tools, that he could move through the unfolding hours with a calm authority born from understanding, and that the next steps would be determined not by emotion but by insight, allowing him to navigate a changed home, a fractured relationship, and the presence of the two people whose actions had shaped the course of his life without his consent. Michael remained in the living room, his hands resting lightly on the back of the sofa, breathing slowly. As the quiet stretched in the house, Sarah moved toward the hallway, glancing back occasionally, the weight of unspoken explanations in her posture, while Jason lingered near the doorway, uncertain how to respond to Michael's calm presence that radiated quiet authority. Michael's mind traced the sequence of months, recalling subtle shifts in conversation, evenings she had claimed to be working late, weekends where she needed time alone, casual mentions of Jason, and he understood the pattern with a clarity that had grown from patient observation, the pieces aligning into a truth that no argument could change. He looked around at familiar objects, the coffee table, the cushions, the half-filled mug on the counter, and realized that the ordinary domestic space had become a stage for recognition, every item charged with the significance of attention, presence, and absence. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock marked the passage of time, yet the emotional weight in the room made minutes feel stretched, allowing Michael to process the extent of change that had occurred quietly over weeks and months. Sarah tried to speak, her tone measured, offering explanations and reassurances that floated in the air like paper in a breeze, but Michael understood the intent behind the words, the effort to maintain composure while the truth had already been revealed by gestures, glances, and the presence of Jason. He traced the evolution of his own patience, the countless small compromises, the quiet endurance of missed attention and subtle shifts in behavior, and he recognized that his calm observation had prepared him for this moment, giving him the perspective and strength to respond deliberately rather than react impulsively. The light through the blinds softened further as evening settled in, long shadows stretching across the floor, highlighting the ordinary details of the room that now carried extraordinary significance. He considered the presence of Jason once more, noting the slight tension in his stance, the acknowledgement that Michael's measured demeanor had altered the dynamics of the room, creating an authority derived from clarity and self-possession rather than confrontation. Michael's thoughts wandered through the past routines, the shared mornings with coffee, the evenings once filled with conversation and laughter, and he recognized how the patterns of small absences, minor evasions, and careful distance had accumulated into a life quietly rearranged without his knowledge. The realization did not fill him with anger, but with a firm understanding that the next steps required strategic awareness, calm action, and quiet authority, and that by observing and understanding, he had regained control over the unfolding situation. The living room, familiar and domestic, now felt like a space where truth could be seen clearly, where measured presence had more power than words, and Michael allowed himself a slow, steady breath, sensing the ability to move forward with clarity, maintaining dignity while navigating the altered reality of his home, the relationship, and the presence of the two people whose choices had shaped the events around him. Michael stayed in the living room longer than anyone expected, not because he was confused, but because he had finally stopped rushing toward a version of events that no longer existed. The stillness in the room felt almost deliberate now, like the house itself was waiting to see what he would do next, and that quiet gave him the space to notice details that once would have escaped him. The way Sarah kept glancing toward the hallway, the way Jason kept his weight shifted toward the door, the way both of them were careful not to speak over one another unless it served the story they had already rehearsed. Michael looked at the soft light falling across the rug, the coffee table with a few magazines stacked neatly on one corner, the framed photo on the shelf from a summer trip to the coast. And he saw how many ordinary objects had outlasted the honesty in the room. He thought about the months when Sarah had seemed farther away, not in one dramatic moment, but in a slow, careful retreat that he had mistaken for stress, for work pressure, for the normal tiredness that comes with adult life. And he recognized now that he had been giving explanations to patterns that were never meant to be explained away. Sarah finally said his name again, more gently this time, and asked whether they could all sit down and talk it through. But the phrase landed with a strange emptiness, because Michael understood that talking through something requires both people to be honest about what happened, and honesty was the one thing still missing from the room. Jason cleared his throat once, then looked toward the hallway as if hoping the conversation might move somewhere easier. But Michael did not grant that escape, not because he wanted to punish anyone, but because he needed to see the truth clearly before deciding what kind of man he would be in the aftermath. He remained calm, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing even, and that calm seemed to unsettle Sarah more than anger ever could, because she had prepared for tears, arguments, maybe even desperation, but not for a silence that no longer belonged to her. Michael remembered the simple routines that had once defined the house, the Saturday coffee, the grocery runs, the easy jokes in the kitchen, and he realized those routines had not protected the marriage the way he believed they would. They had simply made it easier for a quiet distance to grow unnoticed. And now that distance stood in the room with them in the form of a divorce notice, a best friend, and a conversation that no one could make small again. He looked at Sarah and saw not only the woman he had married, but the version of her he had trusted to be honest when the world got complicated. And in that trust he found the root of his disappointment, because what hurt most was not only the choice she made, but the time she let him continue believing in a shared future while she moved in a different direction. Michael asked one final question, not loud, not sharp, just clear enough to leave no room for a comfortable answer. And Sarah hesitated before responding, her words careful and measured, yet still unable to hide the fact that too much had already happened for this to be called confusion by the time the answer ended. Michael knew the next part of his life would not be shaped by what Sarah or Jason wanted, but by the quiet, steady way he chose to leave the room standing. I stayed in my office long after the kids were asleep, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Every surface seemed to echo the emptiness I felt, and I let myself sit with it, feeling the weight of weeks, months, maybe years of small betrayals and unspoken resentments. The stack of unopened bills on the counter reminded me that life went on, indifferent to personal turmoil. I walked to the window and watched the streetlights flicker, their reflection in the glass like scattered fragments of memory I could barely piece together. The rustle of the curtains whispered of times I had tried to ignore the subtle shifts in our marriage, the small lies that had compounded into this overwhelming tension. I remembered the Saturday afternoons when laughter filled the air, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the block, the simple joy of idle conversations that now seemed almost foreign. My thoughts drifted to her, moving gracefully through her day, oblivious or indifferent to the storm brewing in my mind. I considered what had brought us here, the choices, the compromises, the silent agreements that neither of us honored fully. Each memory was a mirror reflecting a different version of us, some faded, some sharp, all weighted with a quiet sorrow. I thought of the times I had held my tongue, had nodded along, had smiled while feeling the sting of condescension or disregard. I felt the adrenaline of confrontation ebbing, replaced by a calm resolve that I had not known before. The decision I had made earlier, to gather evidence, to watch, to prepare, was no longer just a strategy. It had become a lifeline. A sense of purpose replaced the dull ache of betrayal. I moved back to my desk, pulled open the drawers, and examined the papers, receipts, notes, every small thing I had collected. The details mattered. They were the map through the labyrinth of deceit. I organized, cataloged, and traced patterns, each one sharpening my understanding, each one reinforcing the certainty that I was not imagining things, that the fractures I felt were real and significant. I felt the steady beat of my own heart, a metronome that measured the passing of time and the rhythm of determination settling in my chest. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the panes, carrying the faint scent of rain. I opened a folder containing recordings I had made, a careful archive of moments unnoticed, moments revealing truths unspoken. Listening, I felt the quiet justice of awareness, the balance of knowledge against ignorance, the leverage that understanding gave me. Hours passed like minutes, and I remained there, a silent observer, neither rushing nor hesitating, allowing the unfolding clarity to settle in. When the house finally seemed still, I leaned back and allowed a rare, unguarded breath. I was alone, yet not lonely. The solitude was a crucible, shaping resolve from pain. I knew what had to come next, the steps I would take, the careful precision of timing, the necessity of calm action. Each decision, each movement, was now part of a larger design, one that would demand patience and clarity, but also a relentless adherence to truth. In that quiet night, I felt the gravity of all the past weeks and months coalescing into something solid. I was no longer at the mercy of circumstance or the caprices of another. I had the map, I had the knowledge, and I had the calm conviction to act when the time came, to reclaim not just the life that had been fractured, but the dignity and authority that had been quietly eroded over the years. I looked at the clock, its hands crawling forward, a slow reminder that the world would continue to turn, indifferent to personal vendettas, yet I was ready, poised, and in full control of the storm that lay ahead. I sat in the quiet of that room until the first gray light began to press through the blinds, and by then the fear that had lived in my chest for so long had turned into something steadier, something harder to shake. I was no longer chasing the truth. I had already found it. The folder on my desk was thicker than it had been the night before, lined with receipts, call logs, saved messages, and the small details that people forget to protect when they are busy believing their own story. I read through it one more time, not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted every page to remind me that clarity had a shape, and that shape was in my hands now. By the time I heard movement upstairs, I had already made the decision to stay calm, speak only when necessary, and let the facts do what emotions never could. When she came down the stairs, she looked polished in that effortless way she always did when she wanted the world to think nothing had changed. Her voice was careful, almost gentle, as she asked if we could talk later, as if later still belonged to us. I looked at her and felt no anger, no pleading, no confusion, just a deep and quiet understanding that every unanswered question had finally found its answer. I told her I had already spoken to the lawyer, that I had already backed up everything, and that from this point forward there would be no more guessing, no more rewriting, no more pretending the silence meant peace. The room changed when I said it, not because I raised my voice, but because the truth has a way of making lies feel smaller the moment it enters the room. She stood there without speaking, and I could see it in her face, the instant she realized the life she had been counting on was no longer something she could control. I did not insult her. I did not beg her. I simply told her that a marriage cannot survive when one person is building trust and the other is building an exit. Then I turned back to the table, placed the folder inside my bag, and said the only thing I still believed needed to be said. I was done carrying a story that had stopped being mine. A few hours later, I stepped outside into the cold morning air and felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift, one breath at a time. The sky was pale, the street was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was walking forward instead of surviving in place. Have you ever watched the truth arrive so slowly that by the time it did, everything around it had already changed? And if this story kept you until the end, take a second to subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, and the next one may hit closer to home than you expect.